presentation with us. So this panel is called the Policing, Gender, Reproduction, Sex, and Sexuality panel, which has agreed a lot of issues on one title, Andrea. Just throw it all in. It's intended to be a deeper dive into issues around policing of trans and gender nonconforming bodies, policing of prostitution and trafficking, and policing and criminalization of pregnancy, pregnancy termination, and parenting. All of this, which we've briefly or have been talking about yesterday and earlier today, or some things that were mentioned anyway. So as we make our way to the stage, I'm going to just go ahead and read some of the short bios of our fantastic panelists. Everybody's looking good. So I'm going to start with Jill Adams. And Jill Adams is the Executive Director and for the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice. Her focus is on criminalization of women who may self-induce abortions using legally available drugs and of adverse pregnancy outcomes. So thanks for joining us, Jill. And then we have Monica Jones. So I'm just reading these in the order in which the speakers will engage us. Monica Jones, who is visiting, is a sex worker rights activist and founder of OUTLAW. She led a challenge to Arizona's manifesting an intent to engage in prostitution laws. Also has experience with bathroom and gender policing. Thanks. And then we also have Emmy Koyama, a homie from back in the day when I used to live in Seattle. Happy to see your dog again. And meet your nephew. Emmy Koyama runs a coalition for rights and safety for people in the sex trade. Emmy writes a lot of things. If you've ever visited her blog, it's an amazing archive. And also she publishes on policing and criminalization of prostitution, trafficking, trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex people. And like people mentioned, there are some items that you could purchase, and they're fairly affordable. I think Monica has some t-shirts that are pretty hot. And if you want to like cut them, like I cut everything because I like to look a little slutty, you can do that to those and just up your game. Step it up. And then there's also these fabulous little pins that Emmy Koyama makes, and a lot of her amazing zines are here too. I know I've also, like Elisa, been buying those pins for a long time. I remember the first one that I bought said, hookers are your neighbors too. I was like, oh my God, I was so excited. I was like 21, and I was like sporting that, and it was so happy to see that somebody actually made these kind of statements that I could wear as a button. So anyway, I'm really happy to have everybody here and for this incredible panel. So why don't we just start with Jill, and you can talk to us a little bit about some key issues and some of your work with your organization and your activist work.
Hi everyone, it's a real honor to be here with Emmy and Monica and all of you. See folks like Shayna, who I met 10 years ago, who's been inspiring me since. This is quite an honor. Thank you. To be Black, pregnant, and living in poverty in the U.S. today is to be maligned, disregarded, surveilled, suspected, stigmatized, and confronted with obstacles at every turn. Pregnancy is a naturally occurring health condition with two potential outcomes: birth or a pregnancy loss. And there are, different types of each. So a birth could result in a live child or in a stillbirth. A pregnancy loss could be a spontaneous miscarriage, or it could be a prompted abortion. I want to focus on two of those outcomes that are actually volitional, and how people might arrive at a healthy, dignified birth or a healthy, dignified abortion, whichever they choose. For people of color in particular who are living in poverty, who are pregnant, to get from the point of pregnancy discovery to the destination of a healthy, dignified birth or abortion is to run an obstacle course within a maze. And depending on different identities and different conditions, there may be more more obstacles, more impediments, and more dead ends that can keep them from ever getting out the other side of the maze. And the goal ultimately is to get to the other side alive, healthy, free, and with their rights and their dignity intact. And for those few who do make it from the starting point to that ending point, it's as though they have to possess superhuman powers and tremendously good fortune to get there in this day and age. So let's start, let's imagine, and these impediments, like, yes, interactions with law enforcement are one of them, but I think it's really important to consider the totality of the circumstances and all of the different interlocking structural oppressions that are acting upon them, all the different systems, all the different institutions. So I want to walk us through this obstacle course maze. Let's start with somebody who's at the point of pregnancy discovery and they're excited about it. They're elated. They want to have this baby. So they may be super excited about having the baby, but they may be scared about actually birthing the baby because they know about their limited options and conditions, right? Maybe they would love to have a birth that occurred in their home or outside of a hospital setting, but that's completely unaffordable for them. Or maybe there are no birth workers who are of their race or their culture or who will affirm their gender. And so maybe it's just, for one reason or another, not an option, and they know that they will be giving birth in a hospital. Here in California, let's say this person is African American. Here in California, they know if they go and give birth in a hospital, they are 4 times more likely to die than a white woman who goes into the same hospital and gives birth. And this is when we account for health conditions, prenatal care, income level, education level, every other factor. So that may be a factor that's weighing on their minds. Maybe they, oh, and by the way, there's really terrific research by Dr. Monica McLemore and others on the effects of weathering, of racist weathering in birth outcomes. You may have seen Monica McLemore on some billboards around town lately. Maybe this person is scared to seek medical help because they're self-medicating using an illegal substance. Mm-hmm. They'd love to seek treatment, but there are no rehab facilities for people who are pregnant. Or they know that if you are pregnant and you are using an illicit substance, you could get locked up for the duration of pregnancy and be forced to undergo withdrawals without treatment in the name of protecting the fetus. Maybe they're worried that if they present to a clinic or a hospital for prenatal care or childbirth, their blood will be tested, probably without their consent, and they'll be arrested for neonatal exposure to drugs. Because in a third of states, they consider illicit drug use by pregnant people to be child abuse. And they could end up like Regina McKnight in South Carolina being charged for homicide by child abuse. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's say they make it to the hospital to get to go through childbirth. Maybe they're scared they're not going to be given enough painkillers because of these, what has now been well documented as beliefs among medical professionals that African American and Black people can withstand higher levels of pain and don't need as much and do not get as much pain treatment as white patients do. Maybe they're really concerned of having their agency removed in the birthing process, of having to undergo all sorts of medical interventions, not of their own choosing, but medical interventions for the sake of teaching other people at that hospital, for the sake of convenience, for doctors and other medical personnel, for the sake of profit for the hospitals and the HMOs, up to and including court-ordered cesarean sections that they don't want to have, as was the case of Aisha Majun in the District of Columbia, where sometimes there's an emergency court hearing where the pregnant patient is not afforded an attorney, but the fetus is and the hospital is. And they're forced to undergo this and other forms of obstetric violence without their consideration. And if they resist, they face criminal sanctions. So maybe they make it through this entire process and they have a healthy baby and they're so excited to take their baby home. But the social worker stands in the way because they've got to approve of the car seat and the mode of transportation and maybe even do a home visit to make sure that everything checks out. And if it doesn't, they don't get to take their baby home. And the way that this plays out in the racial disparities and the way that this plays out are very well documented in Kiara Bridges' book, Reproducing Race, the Ethnography of Pregnancy as a Site of Racism. So even if this person gets this far along in the obstacle course, they're successful in being able to survive birth without unnecessary medical interventions, they get to take their baby home, they may go to the county welfare office to sign, to enroll their new child in the TANF program, only to discover that they live in one of 17 states with a racist, classist, sexist welfare family cap, which means that if they have the audacity to get pregnant while they or someone else in their family were already receiving basic needs cash assistance, that baby that was just born is ineligible for aid. So they now have to take care of even more people with the same amount of money, even less to go around per head. I mean, these are policies that California had one for 20 years, up until very recently. So they're not all places where you would necessarily expect, but they are motivated by eugenics and they are justified using the welfare queen trope. And so even without this increase in basic needs cash assistance, they're doing everything they can to get by. TANF requires that they work outside the home. There's no subsidized daycare. They find a daycare site. That daycare site requires that if they drop their kid off, they have to drop their kid off with a certain number of diapers. They can't afford the diapers, so they can't take the kid to daycare. Either they don't go to work, which then they'll get in trouble for, or they drop the kid off maybe with a neighbor, maybe with a family member. If anything happens, kid goes into the system, they lose their parental rights, and they get charged with maybe neglect, maybe something worse. So that's one potential trajectory. Now let's look back at the starting point of somebody who wants to reach a different ultimate destination. They're pregnant, they don't want to have a child, so they're seeking an abortion. If they live in one of 33 states or DC that has adopted the Federal Convention of the Hyde Amendment, it means that Medicaid doesn't cover abortion care in their state. And out-of-pocket costs for a first trimester abortion are about $500. So if you can qualify for Medicaid, that is a prohibitively high cost, and that's just for the service itself. That doesn't account for travel, overnight stays if you live in a state that has a waiting requirement, childcare if you already have children at home, and lost wages. If they're able though to pull together the funds, it might be a great personal cost. Being evicted for not paying rent, selling wedding rings and other very prized sentimental possessions, going without utilities, food, medication. And then if they make it to the clinic, they have to walk sometimes through a gamut of protesters screaming at them. And if they're African American, if they're black, calling them genocidal murderers who are succumbing to white supremacy and killing off their own race. If, like a quarter of the people in their position, they're not able to pull together the funds, they'll end up carrying that pregnancy to term. And 2 years out, they are 3 times more likely to be living under the federal poverty level than somebody in their position who is able to receive the abortion care they needed. Now, some resourceful people who are pregnant and don't want to be pregnant will find a third way, through self-inducing abortion. They may buy abortion pills from online pharmacies, or obtain herbs from healers in their communities. We know anecdotally that people are doing this safely and effectively at home, but say the person's just concerned something might be wrong, so they go to a hospital to seek medical care. They say they're having a miscarriage, but the medical staff are suspicious that they're lying because they're not showing the appropriate level of remorse for somebody who has lost a pregnancy, or perhaps simply because they're black and not to be trusted. So the healthcare worker calls the cops, who interrogate the patient while they lie in a hospital bed with or without a lawyer present. Perhaps they even confiscate the person's phone, and they uncover evidence through texts or through emails that this person was planning to, or did in fact, attempt to end their own pregnancy. They could end up, like so many others, in prison or deported. And in many of these cases, they didn't even break a law that clearly prohibited self-managed abortion. They just got nailed with whatever charge an overzealous prosecutor could throw at them that would stick. So in Kinlissia Jones's case in Georgia, they tried hard to get her for malice murder and couldn't, so she ended up with the possession of a dangerous substance charge. To recap, pregnant Black people living in poverty face a multitude of barriers to accessing high-quality reproductive health care, stigmatizing and demoralizing treatment at the hands of medical professionals, and criminalization for myriad acts and omissions. But we all know that it's often not actions, but identities that lead to criminalization. So just by virtue of being Black, poor, and pregnant, they'll never get out of the maze.
Yeah, if there's any connections between trans health care and child care and pregnancy.
Okay, so I can touch on that. So my name is Monica Jones, and so I'm a Black trans woman, growing up in Phoenix, Arizona. And growing up there, I grew up in a house full of women. It was 3 generations of women raising their children together, co-parenting. Before co-parenting was cool, my grandmother, my moms, and my aunts, and great-grandmother were co-parenting their children together. And sex was talked about freely, especially like the Black woman, sexuality as a Black woman was taught freely in this house. And so this shaped my point of view about sexuality, about how I should be treated. And growing up, and then when I started transitioning, I was in a studio apartment receiving Social Security, and by the end of the week, I was broke after paying rent and buying food and waiting for the next check to come through. And all of a sudden, I decided, I had got an offer. I was talking to this guy at a bar, and he offered me $300 for services. And I was like, okay, I was going to have sex with you, but that $300 is going to help me out pay my bills. I took that, and that embarked my journey onto sex work. And as a Black trans woman, college was out of my picture. I was a person with a disability, learning disability, so college was out of my picture because right after high school I went to college, felt horribly at college, and couldn't go back until I paid off my grants. And so while 21, I started engaging in sex work to survive and thrive in this world, navigate this society, help with my transitional costs. And I became very aware of my body and the power that my body had, because externally people were saying that I was a freak, I wasn't woman, I wasn't beautiful, I wasn't this. And my clients were telling me that otherwise, that I was desirable, that I was worthy, that I was a goddess, that I was a queen. Things that many trans women don't hear on their day-to-day life, just working their 9-to-5 job. They hear other slurs and everything else, face transphobia. And sex work itself is not transphobic. It doesn't discriminate based on your gender and sexual orientation, because sex work itself is liberating. Because if you think about anybody who engages in sex work, it's sex work being any person who is consensual and doing it by themselves. And if you think about it, being a sex worker, it allowed me to have these great opportunities. But then what we have is the policing of that. Mm-hmm. And this goes back hundreds of years due to policing of Black bodies and people in low-income situations. And so in Phoenix, we have these manifestation laws. And these laws only take place in low-income areas. And so I live in a low-income area, and because the state says, Phoenix, the city says that this is a low-income area, so there's a high likely of prostitution in this area, sex work in this area, we're going to have these manifestation laws, and that place ordinance. They're not laws, they're ordinance. And that means anyone can be arrested for looking like a sex worker. And this is based on the way we dress. So right now, the way I'm dressed, if I was walking home, I could be arrested. if you're a poor woman just walking down the street and you're homeless, you can be arrested for a manifestation. And these laws get you introduced into the justice system. And that's my first interaction with the justice system, was being charged with my first manifestation. And you know what I did? I pleaded out. Even though I could have fought it, I pleaded out. And the second time around, you have to fight. And the reason why people say, like, now I understand why people plead out. Because if you're going through these cases, it takes a whole toll on the individual. You might have the great lawyer team, but what about yourself? And sometimes they might just think about, we're gonna get you to court and that's it. But they're not thinking about like your emotional status, like your mental health and everything else. And so I think it's very important, if you're doing the work, if you're a lawyer and you're doing work with low-income people, make sure if they're doing a case, make sure that you have a social worker and a facility doing mental health and emotional health there, or even a community healer in that facility. And so to make the link between like trans bodies, our bodies are policed generally through community policing and policing by the police and policing by our healthcare providers. And I receive access through the state, and I cannot tell my health provider what kind of hormone treatment I want, because my health provider says, well, this is what they read, and I'm only allowed 2 milligrams of estrogen pills. And what I need is the hormone shots, and so I can't get that. And as a trans woman in the future who's looking to have children, I can't have that conversation on the right hormone balance between now and so when I want to have children, and so everything else is based on your healthcare provider who might be a nice person, but don't have the educational needs or that own the experience and the lived experience of a trans person. And so I think it's very important that we have these conversations with people and who provide services to those people who are intersectionally using those services. For a Black trans woman seeking reproductive services at the clinic, may face barriers to receive those services, such as the right Viagra. I know many trans individuals who need the services to get Viagra, but they can't get it because their insurance doesn't cover it. Or the trans man who needs access to services for prenatal things, and they can't get it because the person who is doing the check-in is super transphobic, and the sign-in sheet is very gender binary and not explain that the variety of people who receive services in those communities. And so it's very hard when you're a trans person existing in this world where gender binary, where gender plays the most important role. And just coming here to Phoenix, like coming to Berkeley, right? I have to go through TSA, and as a trans woman, having your body screen through that thing and being pulled out because they need to pat you down because your genitalia doesn't match what they have on the screen, and so you have to be pat down in front of everyone, and having the guy behind you saying something smart, and you have to deal with that because now you're in the middle of TSA custody because they have to pat you down. And these things happen, policing of our bodies happen every time we step outside. Every time we receive services, even if we go to colleges, our bodies are policed. And even trying to use the bathroom in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was a college student at Phoenix Community College, I was joining the gym, and I've been using the gym before I transitioned, but I never had to dress out because the gym hours were enough where I can go in after my classes and work out and go home. But the hours changed, and I had to start using the locker room. And when I asked to use the women's, do they have a unisex locker room, they told me no, use the men's locker room. And then when I said, like, are you providing my safety? they said, use the locker, use your bathroom at home. And this went on for like 2 semesters of me going back and forth with the facilitator of the fitness center, back and forth, and finally I had enough and I had to make a video to explain my experience as a trans woman trying to use the shower room, just to shower my body from working out. And dealing with that, the school finally got a hold of the information, and finally, because of people calling in, they finally changed the Maricopa Community College school policy that protects people of trans identity and gender identity. And now that's in the school policy. Before, there was not, because someone had to fight back. And it's so many times when you're at these intersectionalities, it's hit on you to fight back. And sometimes it's really great when your allies do the fighting for you before you even step into the place. Before you even walk into the place, they're like, hey, we got this covered, and we know you're trans, we know all these issues. And sometimes it's very important that our allies do the work before we even step into the place.
Well, I'm so glad to be here sharing space with all of you, and especially Alisa and Andrew, 2 people that, I've learned from and worked with, and, also Xandra, of course, from the time that we had the Community Against Rape and Abuse in Seattle, that came up with a really amazing community, what is it? Community accountability document, which is in the INCITE book that I think the bookstore is coming to sell, and also Annie Smith really helped, just really learned a lot about, all this stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about, so my name is Emmy, and apparently my scenes are really good. And so currently I coordinate an organization, or the coalition, called the Coalition for Rights and Safety for People in the Sex Trade in Seattle, King County, Washington State. And so my position is coordinatrix, which is amazing. But coordinatrix. Yeah, so but before that, and I've been doing lots of, I come from doing domestic violence and sexual assault work, first studying it in the central Maine, rural Maine, and seeing that in the Take Back the Night March, they have a bunch of white male police officers standing in the front and talking about how we're going to protect all women and kind of thing, and just really well, that doesn't feel like that kind of power that Take Back the Night was intended to be, right? And then just so going through coming from really mainstream, mainstream white middle class state-based anti-violence movement, and recognizing their issues with it, and moving from that to realizing that even the domestic violence shelter system is the way the community deal with the domestic violence by putting the abuser in the prison or jail, and then putting this victim in the shelter, and then the rest of the community go on as if nothing happened. And this is the way that contemporary society tried to deal with the community, with violence in the community, and it's not really helpful. And the shelters themselves are not really good strategy to deal with this. So I started looking at that. I was also doing lots of work around the sexual abuse and sexual violence advocacy, where many of the services and how they're created are not all that helpful. And not only are they not helpful in general, but it's not helpful particularly to certain community members who are already marginalized. So when you look at I was working at the domestic violence shelter for a while, and seeing that it's always the women of color who get penalized for not violating the shelter rules. They're doing all these things wrong, and then they get kicked out from the shelter. And then when you get kicked out from the domestic violence shelter, you also lose lots of services. I think that's one of the reasons shelters are really bad, is because shelter combines the services and housing. So if you lose housing, you lose services, and if you don't get the services because they're not respectful, then if you refuse to participate in service, then you get kicked out, so you lose housing also. So it's just really not really well-designed system. So I started writing a lot about that and I also do lots of disability activism, intersex activism, and all of those, all of those together really gave me this perspective that there are all those institutions that's built to supposedly help people, but they're not helping. They're often causing more harm, or they're actually participating in violence in the community. So and when I look into the ways that our society deals with the prostitution, sex work, sex trade, and sex trafficking, there's so much panic about sex trafficking, and there's so much politicians talk about how they want to protect sex work people in sex trafficking. They just passed a law that's going to make it so that they can go after the website that sex workers and people in the sex trade use to advertise their services. And that's the tool people use to protect themselves by screening, so that they can have some of the websites like eBay, and you can, it's not eBay, but it's has the reputation system, the review system, so that that who can be trusted and who should not be trusted, and it enables all those things. And without it, you have to see somebody driving down the street and decide in a split second whether this is safe or not, and that's what the kind of a crackdown that enforces it. So even though they talk about how they want to protect the victims of sex trafficking and people who are vulnerable, but they're actually doing the opposite. And when you look at that became my focus of my work for a while, and just really doing lots of research, and that's what looking into ways that those projects, anti-trafficking projects, repurposes the same exact dynamics that exist in war on drugs and war on terror, and they just change the label. And protecting our children, protecting our women is always a really great political tool, and yet in reality it's really harmful in many ways, and it hampers our ability to organize to actually protect ourselves. Because when there's a law around sex trafficking that defines anybody in the sex trade helping each other as form of trafficking, they're pimping each other, then obviously we're not able to organize. When they shut down those websites, we're not able to protect ourselves and protect our community. It doesn't allow us to have a decision. And when you look at the whole policing of the sex trade from the beginning, we see that first federal legislation to target the prostitution was the Mann Act, which happened after the Civil War, after the when there was this white slavery panic, where even though it started out as a white slavery panic, as in white women being kidnapped and forced into sex trade, but the focal point quickly became Asian women. And of course there are stereotypes that fed into that, the Asian women as hyper-feminine, hyper-submissive, and yet sexually super available. And then that stereotype went along with the idea that they cannot possibly have any agency because the Asian women are so submissive. And this happened at a time when America wanted to bring in Asian and Chinese labor to the US to build things for white people without allowing them to settle. So how do you keep Chinese laborers, Asian laborers from settling in the United States? Well, what they did was they tried to restrict women. Because if the Asian men came to the US and they performed all those labor for the empire, and yet if they didn't have Asian women to marry and have family with, and because there were the misogynist laws that prevented people from different races from marrying, or there are social circumstances that was difficult. So eventually those laborers will leave and go back to where they came from, and that prevents Asian America from forming. And that's I feel like that's how they try to replace the slave labor with another form of a really exploitative slave-like condition, labor of Asian migrant laborers, without allowing the formation of the Asian community. That's at the same time. So the Mann Act was passed, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was formed in part. One of the three goals of the FBI's formation was to enforce this law against prostitution, especially bringing women over across the border, or women traveling across the border, state borders, for the purpose of prostitution. So FBI was formed to address this, this panic of white slavery panic, and also like this the prevention of aging settlement. So this is the background of that, and that's the same time that we started seeing the first immigration restrictions against the Chinese people and other Asian and Japanese people, and throughout the late 19th century to the early 20th century, right? So that's the part of it, and we are really seeing the same thing happening again, right? And earlier this year, the Polaris Project, which is one of the largest anti-trafficking organizations, they issued a new report about illicit massage parlor trafficking, and they're making policy recommendations. To their credit, they're not saying that shut down those massage parlors and deport everybody, but that's the effect of that. If you talk about there's all those like exploitation. They talk about how 100% of the women who work in illicit massage parlors are either exploited or trafficked. The reality is that they are exploited because they're immigrant women, many of them who don't speak English fluently, and so there's lots of like rampant labor abuse. But they're not trying to fix that by protecting everybody's rights as workers, right? They're not trying to protect them by guaranteeing that they are not they're not harmed while at the workplace. Instead, this is like all about addressing it with the criminal justice system, using the police and using the Department of Homeland Security to shut down those places, and often the women who are caught up in this, they're in part considered to be victims, and they want them to testify against the managers and stuff, so that they will be detained. Many of those women actually want to go back to their home country because many of those women they're migrant laborers who are temporary, and they're not intended to live here. So when they get busted, they want to go home, but they're not allowed to do that, and they're kept there and have to, and then they don't have the authorization to work. So it's really difficult for them to stay here and be monitored with the ankle monitor and things like that. So that's the contemporary reformulation of that, is that we're seeing the Department of Homeland Security and the anti-trafficking projects, running in such way. It's not protecting workers, but instead it's we could imagine totally different social interventions, political interventions to actually protect everybody's work rights as workers, and yet instead, this is resulting in a really punitive approach to it, to dealing with this. This internationally, like before 2000, whether it was the International Convention on Trafficking was passed or was signed as part of this international ICPO, the police coordination, and the trafficking victims. What is that? Trafficking Protection Act? Trafficking Victim Protection Act in 2000 was passed. It was considered. It was. The trafficking was addressed before that internationally, but it was under the International Labor Organization. It was under International Organization of Migration. It was seen as a labor exploitation, and the issue of the of the informal or irregular migration that can result in vulnerability for people who are in it, and was addressed mostly through development from the social and economic issue. And then around 2000, it changed to a law enforcement issue predominantly, right? And then it was dealt with that. And then the whole narrative around sex trafficking and human trafficking has shifted like that. And around 2008, it shifted again to be all about domestic minor sex trafficking, which is another word for saying that those our precious innocent white girls in the suburbs are being kidnapped by black men in the city. I mean that's the image that's promoted in media. And within a couple, 2 or 3 years, around 2011, the government focus on the sex trafficking became all about gang enforcement. So I've seen some of the changes in how the government talks about this issue. That before 2010, FBI was talking about how some of the gangs operate the sex prostitution rates, we need to deal with that through, sex trafficking laws. And then after that, they started saying we need to use the sex trafficking laws to target gangs, so that their purpose has shifted. Before they were saying that we would use the trafficking laws gang laws to address trafficking, and later it became about using the trafficking laws to attack gangs. And I was a couple years ago, I was at this community forum in the southern King County, which is in Washington, close to Seattle, and there was a police chief from that town who was one of the speakers. He said, in order to stop the sex trafficking of our girls, we need to get rid of those crap, the rap music. And when a comment like that comes from just random person on the street, you just think they're just racist and biased, etc. When it comes from the mouth of the police chief, their practice has everything to do with surveilling and stopping all the youth of color in the community, and that's exactly what's happening. My nephew Shakur is here. He's 15-year-old. He's really big, but he's 15, and he wants to come to UC Berkeley, despite what he heard last night from the Kirby. Yeah, don't jaywalk here, okay? But he gets stopped. He's he was stopped when you were 11 or something. Yeah, it's just, and that this is the same police that thinks that rap music is the cause of sex trafficking, right? So anyway, I want to wrap up because I'm just talking about so much. The coalition, the coalition has been around for a year, and lots of sex work organizing focuses on decriminalization, which is stopping enforcement of all the policies against people consensually engaging in sex trade, right? Which I support, but I think the ways that the sex worker movement has, and especially the white middle class sex worker movement has talked about decriminalization, is really similar to how white feminism has talked about abortion rights, or how the white gay movement has talked about marriage, right? It's just this singular focus that's really removed from social context and made into the abstract issue of individual rights and equality, and not seeing the context of it. And I think the same thing's happening with this whole call for decriminalization among sex work activists. And I think the same thing happened in the arguments around decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana, right? I mean, you can make medical case that marijuana should not be criminalized, right? You can make a fairly good argument based on individual liberties and social impact, etc. But if you're not looking at the fact that those laws are selectively used to criminalize and incarcerate certain community members, right? And it's affecting the communities and families in a really disproportionate way, that you're not really addressing the issue itself, right? And I feel like the whole issue of the sex trade and the criminalization of the sex trade is similar. So when we started the coalition, instead of saying we want decriminalization of the sex trade, we actually wrote our agreement statement by saying that we recognize the harms caused by the criminalization of sex trade and of marginalized communities, and we work to reduce the criminal justice involvement in the lives of the people of the sex trade. And what that does is that allows us to address any issue that results in disproportionate impact on the people who are in sex trade. It has everything. It's just general criminalization in general. It's the drug laws. It's about homeless policies. The housing and homeless policies. Seattle, it's a horrible place, as people know. And Bear is horrible too. But it's Seattle. Amazon owns or controls 20% of downtown Seattle. So they're the big landlord, as well as they have huge impact on the community. And so, one time the city of Seattle decided to shut down the homeless encampment, arguing that there was sex trafficking happening there, and we want to address that by shutting down the homeless encampment. And the reality was that there was a 17-year-old girl who ran away from her home in New Jersey. Obviously, there were issues in a home, in the community, and the failure of the child welfare system in New Jersey and everywhere. That was the reason that she ran away from that in the first place. And she was trading sex somewhere, she was living in the camp and she was trading sex while she was like living there. And somebody who was in homeless encampment, who was living there, homeless person who was living there, saw that she was doing that, and they were concerned. They talked to the social worker, saying that, hey, would you mind going talking to that girl, because I'm concerned about her. What happened was that they stepped in, those days, as in the social workers who were working with the police stepped in, and they took away the girl and then put her in some kind of residential program. And then she ran away from the residential program right away, went back to the camp, and that's when the city decided to shut down the encampment, because they tried to protect her from the camp, but they couldn't do that anymore. But when you look at it, the camp had an organic way to protect her. Like, there was somebody who was concerned about her well-being. They talked to the social worker to ask them to check in with her. That's the right thing to do. We had the community, this community that she chose to live in, had an organic structure to help each other and trying to figure out the solution if she needed any help, So they did the right thing. And yet the response from the city was to shut down this, And then of course, I don't know if you know anything about the mayor of Seattle, former mayor of Seattle at the time. He's like abused at least like 6 young men. Many of them were homeless. When he was in the 30s, that he was like having sex with a 14-year-old at the time. So whatever, that's the mayor who decided to protect our children, 17-year-old girl from New Jersey, by shutting down the community that she found for herself and evicted her and all the people in it, including the person who was concerned enough about her to try to get her, help, or at least figure out if she needed any help. And so that's what we see. That's what we were fighting with. It's not this abstract law about prostitution is legal or not legal, right? The criminalization is not just about, criminalization is not about what actions are legal or not legal. Criminalization is who is targeted, right? I mean, there's no law that says that police can shoot black people and get away with it, and yet that's what happened. That's the reality, because it's the criminalization is bigger than what the law says, right? It's important to do legal reforms, and I'm actually doing that as a coalition work. I was at the state capitol in Olympia, and it's really weird because my specialty in policy is going there and opposing them. So it was the first time I'm actually getting there and trying to give helpful, testimony that can appeal to mainstream, do-gooders, right? I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? And I really do know that this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. That's not my career. Just pay my bills and do some good stuff, right? So anyway, I just want to kind of
Yeah, no, Amy, I was just going to add to that. I wanted to kind of bounce off of that a little bit about if, we don't want to be trying to do reform work for the rest of our fucking lives, because those small changes, I think somebody mentioned that earlier, aren't really going to change much except for make small changes in the temporary, and then in the next 4 months we have something else or a ton of other things, other policies that we have to fight against. I'm wondering, and I wanted to ask, I know Monica just went to the restroom really quick, so she'll be right back. But I wanted to ask about some of the strategies, and we started to talk about that, especially with community-based strategies about how people can respond to some of these issues. I know that from what all of you have shared, there's a huge impact on people, and it feels like when we talk about all these people, we talk about them as individuals, right? We tell their stories, we say what the violence was, and we talk about ways in which we've tried to help either with law, and now I'm just curious about asking about community-based strategies. Yesterday we talked a little bit about, or actually it was a research strategy that I thought was being discussed as a community strategy, which was interesting. Professor Jones, I don't know if she's in here, but was talking about viewing some of the videotapes that the cop cars have, and I thought it was a community strategy. I was like, oh, can I sign up to watch some of those videos? So are there ways in which either of you, the three of you, have seen successful strategies to around either women who want to self-induce abortion, like how can community people support in this way, especially when we're dealing with minors, or I guess I don't want to say minors, young people who are pregnant with self-induced labor. What are some of the issues or the ways in which community can sort of chime in? How can we help trans women in colleges not have to deal with the bullshit that you went through, Monica, when you had to just like wanted to go to the gym and be healthy? Not have to like advocate for yourself. Are there other people that can stand up for us, like you mentioned, and try to help out? Or people in the camp, like you were mentioning, Emily. So I'm just curious about successful ways and strategies that you've seen community respond that is not based in the law.
My biggest thing, like, that I saw how things work, and like I always like to give credit to credit. Like it's Women with a Vision in like New Orleans, right? And so you see like it was based off a diversity program, but what they really did was like did it with the community and had the community involved, and they did a lot of great works. And so if you're ever like interested in looking like at a model of diversion programs that really work, is Women with a Vision is like one of those most important organizations out there that is doing the work by the community members and for the community members. And so, and if you're an ally, the best thing you can do is go in there and donate. And like, and if you are looking to support trans women on colleges, give them the space to be here. Especially like, I'm looking on UC Berkeley, I can't even find one black trans woman of color on this campus yet. And so like, first give them the space, give them an opportunity to have access to higher education. Then once they're there, make sure the campus is safe. And so you already know the issues that trans people face. Then make sure that they don't have to face it when they come to college.
Listen and be guided by the folks who stand to be the most impacted by criminalization. I brought a few copies of a report from a community engaged research project on self-induced abortion in our communities. Sorry, I don't have enough, that's just all I have left right now. But as the reproductive health rights and justice movements have been there's very disproportionate, resources are allocated very disproportionately. And so it has been largely the white-led mainstream pro-choice organizations that push a lot of advocacy. And so just as this issue was starting to get hot, meaning fundable, and those kinds of organizations were starting to become interested, we pushed pause and said, wait, we need to come together, we need to explore this topic, we need to hear from the folks who have already been and will continue to be the most impacted by this. And just create space to talk about it, to explore, like what does this look like in our communities? What could it look like? What are our greatest hopes and dreams, and what are our greatest fears and concerns about how things could go? Because anytime you shine a light on something, right, there's a chance that you're gonna shine it into safe, dark places that people are choosing for good reasons, and a lot of harm could be done. And so, so that report reveals a lot of great guidance, right? It's like, go slowly. We want to be leaders in crafting the strategies and the policies and the priorities, but that doesn't mean that we want to necessarily be the out in front spokespeople, because there are dangers for our communities to be out in front that other people don't face. So this is a time, allies, to leverage your power and privilege and lay it on the line so that you can execute some of the strategies that we determine to matter. But let yourself, like, put your own skin in the game and get out there while we lead from behind safely.
Yeah, so, I mean, when it comes to people who are in sex trade, it's really hard to organize them, and naturally because of the illegal nature of it, and because of the people really are too busy surviving, the only people who have enough resources to actually organize and do things around the, sex worker rights and rights for people in sex trade happen to be the people who are also white and middle class, because they can afford to do that work, and they can afford to be out in the media and things like that. Many of us are not able to. We're trying to change that. We're trying to and I feel like the way that we're doing in coalition, and coalition, as I said, is so much like reform work rather than the things that I really want to be doing in a really radical grassroots organizing, but it is, I think that what we're trying to correct, and we're not entirely successful yet, is to get some policy people in the government, and it's not just the laws, it's like policies at every level of what they do, and even things that don't mention anything about sex trade or sex work or prostitution, right? Because everything affects us, and the community, trans women, immigrants, and etc. are more, disproportionately impacted by those policies, regardless, who are people in sex trade. It's not the white middle class sex workers who advertise in a really safe website and who have their own working place who are being targeted, primarily, right? So what we want to change is that the ways that policies are being developed and enacted or legislated without any impact, any input whatsoever from people in the sex trade. So, for example, when they pass a law to shut down the Backpage or other websites that people use to advertise, people use to protect themselves, it's not that they listen to sex workers' concern and then they decided that there's something else more important, so let's go with that. They haven't weighed the pros and cons. They haven't listened to people in the sex trade at all. And that really needs to change first before we can have some impact. And at this point, ally organizations that we formed as a coalition because sex worker activists and people in sex trade have tried to tell the government, tell the policy people, and tell the other social service organizations what we need, and yet nobody will listen, and it's just dismissed so easily. So, when the sex worker calls a politician and legislator and say something, that they won't listen. But if we can get the Planned Parenthood to call them and tell them, they will listen. That's differently. This, by the way, in Seattle, Planned Parenthood is really powerful. So that's what we want. In Seattle, there's Washington State, there's an organization called the Legal Voice, which is a leading women's rights and legal advocacy organization doing litigation and legislation. Their board passed a resolution to support the full decriminalization of the consensual sex trade, and it's really radical for the pretty mainstream organization to do that. And they're putting their resources, they're putting their lobbyists to help us do some of the stuff. So that's something that we couldn't do ourselves, and even if we did, even if we funded somebody to go up and talk to the politician, they're never going to listen to us the way that they'll be listened. And so that's really using the allies to really amplify the voices that's completely missing and intentionally ignored from the conversation. And I think that we're really able to, and so that's externally. Internally, some of the coalition members, we have a trans organization. There's Utopia, which is the Pacific Islander trans women's organization, who many of their members are in the sex trade, and they have not been part of the sex worker movement, but they are part of a coalition, so that we can bring them their voices. We're working with the Refugee Women's Alliance. We're working with different organizations that way we can actually incorporate the voices of people in the sex trade who are not in the privileged position where they can afford to be out activists, sex work activists, right? And we're actually doing a intensive survey and focus groups to try to bring their stories to the forefront of our struggles for the sex workers and people in sex trade who are immigrants, trans women, and women of color and all that. So, and we got some money to do that, so we're trying to do that.
During my years of activism, I just ran across this video on Facebook where reproductive rights are being taken away from some women, and especially it's some city down in the South where this white woman is going around and sterilizing individuals who use drugs. And the reason how she's doing it, she's offered them $200 or cash, and then another amount for permanent sterilization. And this is totally based on racism, because I feel in this way where here's this white woman and she's married to a black man and she adopted some white children. Her goal is not to see any children born to crack cocaine or addiction to drugs, but yet she's taken away these women's right at their most vulnerable state. Instead of offering drug services to these individuals in these communities, drug reform policies and everything else, she's going in there, taking away these individuals' rights to have children. And everything else by using them at their most vulnerable, using coercion to get them to sign documents, even if they're on drugs, to sign documents to consent to having their reproductive rights taken away from them. Is there any work you know out there that is going against this?
I'm so glad you raised that, because just even getting to that point, that starting point of pregnancy, is a huge victory in and of itself, because it means people have overcome, particularly for people of color living in poverty, and even more particularly for Black and African American people living in poverty, because that means they have overcome coercive contraception that has led them to have long-acting reversible contraceptives that only somebody in a white coat can insert into their bodies or remove. It means they have overcome, issues with fertility that can come from weathering, that can come from toxic exposure in their living situations and their work conditions, and it means they have somehow escaped forced sterilization, which is, again, a victory. This country has such an enormous history and present and current condition of forcibly sterilizing people from immigrant communities and communities of color particularly. There's a bill in California right now for reparations for people who were sterilized by the state. And South Carolina, or I think it's South Carolina and Virginia already have reparations, but California sterilized 20,000 people legally, right? I mean, and so that's just, the Nazi regime borrowed the book on how to sterilize people from the state of California. And it was only because of the actions of the Third Reich that eugenic-based sterilization programs were sort of fell out of favor in the United States. But it's not to say that it's not still happening. It's happening in our prison system, as we saw, right, through the work of Justice Now, uncovering violations of human rights for people who are incarcerated here in California's women's prisons. There were like over 140 people sterilized illegally, often without their consent, often without them even knowing that they've been sterilized. And it's happening at the hands of private actors, right? Whether it is medical professionals who just think that they know better for their patients than their patients know for themselves, whether it's, having patients sign consent forms when they're coming out of surgery, whether they're under the influence of drugs, or people, any kind of the drugs they get in hospitals, or, the ways that they're self-medicating, or, folks like this is I think it was a program called Crack with a K, and they used to have billboards, and it was like in the 80s, but apparently it's still happening today.
Early 2000s. Yeah.
Early 2000s even,
yeah.
Wow.
But they changed their name. If you look them up, it's still the same woman that's raising private funds to keep it going.
Yeah.
But they changed their name. Does anybody know?
Project Prevention.
There you go.
Project Prevention.
It's no longer Crack.
Yeah.
So I'd like to help you out so that you can get to a treatment facility.
Right.
If you don't want to continue using this substance, I want to help you out. I want to rob you of your ability to reproduce, because that's what's right for society. And I will hand over the mic, but just so we know, the crack epidemic, right, is false. It was just, again, based on very racist notions. They've done longitudinal studies. They have followed the quote-unquote crack babies who were born in the 80s. These are just kids who were exposed to these substances in utero. They're fine. They are fine. They are living their lives, right? But it was this epidemic, and we're now seeing it repeated around opioids, right? It's not, and we're going to see how this plays out in the media and in policing and in sentencing. And I'm going to just venture to guess that certain people are going to, in certain communities, are going to be far more criminalized and punished far for doing the exact same things as affluent communities.
But what people do now, we're getting down to that, sorry.
That was funny. Thank
People are
you.
doing things.
Yes, they are. So thank you. And I also want to say, even though through all the statistics, the Black population is still growing. And we're overcoming so many things. It's like there are Black children are being born, there are Black families, there's Black love there. And so even though we face so many adversities, we still is our growing population. And the myth of the lack of a Black family is a lie. Because there are Black families out there today. My mom and dad is a proof of a Black family. Even though they went their separate ways, they are back together. So that's Black love right there.
Thank you. I think with that positive messaging, we're going to close. Thank you so much, panelists. Thanks for visiting us and sharing it.
If you didn't get my shirts, get my shirts.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to act like you support someone, buy our stuff.
Yes.